Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my room. In this video, I'm going to continue talking about the question of criticism for INFJs. Are we particularly sensitive to criticism? In the video that I made yesterday, I was saying, yes, I think that on average, we tend to be. Now, it's interesting because there were people in the comments whose reactions were really interesting, not only in themselves, which they were, but also because of their diversity, because of their variety. There were some people who were saying, it's true, I tend to be sensitive in this and that context. There were also people, such as Vincent, hi Vincent, who were saying that they were actually quite welcoming of criticism and that they were not too fazed by it, which honestly makes me very happy. It's great to know that it's possible for INFJs to manage to take criticism constructively and not to be too overwhelmed by it or too upset by it. It suggests that there's a way, a sort of solution in sight for those who are a bit stuck. And I would count myself among those who are kind of halfway towards, reaching a state of being capable of taking criticism for what it is and well. But in this video, I guess what I want to talk about is just particular strategies, particular ways, particular devices, I would almost want to say, that can allow INFJs, the sensitive ones, the snowflakes ones, who can, that will be able to help them to take criticism less personally, in a way that upsets them less, in a way that makes them question themselves less. So I think maybe the first thing that I would want to point out is there is always, if you like, this is how I do it. I call it a heuristic approach. A heuristic approach to criticism. In philosophy, heuristics, in one definition of it, it's spelled Heuristics, if my French translation of spelling is correct, because spelling is, when I actually kind of say it out loud, it's one of the things that I kind of sometimes still fast translate from English to French in my brain. Hey, my cat Hazelnut is, you can't see her, but she's making some noise. She's in my room. So, heuristic, in one meaning of the term, means that it's a little bit, it reminds me of some comportmentalist psychology. I don't know if it's called that in English, but you sort of you consistently learn to apply practical devices to deal with stressful situations or to deal with upsetting situations, so that they upset you less, and by dint of repeating that practical little exercise, it will not necessarily dig into your psyche to become one of the new variables of how you apprehend the world, but you will at least become used. You will integrate this device into your own reactions to things, so that it's like a protective measure that you can apply. So for instance, a typical one that we hear a lot and sometimes is looked at with an ironic gaze is that of in French we call it to relativize a situation. In other words, to always see a situation not in absolute terms but in relative terms. So if you're facing situation A, instead of just seeing it as situation A, to see it as situation A in relation to B, for example. So not A, but AB. Imagine that you're looking at situation A, and situation A is you failing at an exam. Perhaps situation B could be a hypothetical situation in which you die of a horrible disease. All right. So when people say, well, it could always be worse, think about the people who are starving in the world. And it sounds like it's a truism or it's not useful, but actually it can be quite useful to sort of imagine a worse situation that you could have ended up in, maybe realistically ended up in, and compare it to the situation that upsets you, because you will gain some hindsight on the fact that maybe the situation that upsets you is not that destructive of your future. And it's a heuristic device, learning to always relativize situations. And I think it works in the case of criticism as well. It could always be worse, and it could always be a lot worse. So to heuristically learn to relativize situations is a useful tool that I use myself. But in the case of criticism, we're not just talking about comparing your situation to a situation in which the criticism was worse, or a situation in which what upset you was something way worse than criticism. The relativistic nature of criticism is, it goes way beyond that. It's relativistic because it is subjectivistic in some way. And when I say that it is subjectivistic, I mean that it is mediated through not even just one, but two subjectivities. It is mediated through the subjectivity of the person who critiques, and it is mediated through the subjectivity of your own reaction to the critique of the person who critiques. So imagine that the person says something and that you find it upsetting. Well, keep in mind that first of all, it is the person's opinion. So that's, again, it's a truism, and sometimes we see that it is not quite enough. It's not quite enough for us to tell ourselves, yeah, but it's only their opinion, because it still hurts, regardless of whether or not we try to convince ourselves that it is just their opinion. Note that sometimes when it really hurts is when there's something that is objectively true and not just the subjectivity of the person, but that's maybe beside the point at this stage. So it is mediated by two subjectivities. It is not just what people say to make you feel better when they say it's only their opinion. It's objectively their subjective opinion, if you like. It comes from them. So when when a critique is voiced that is hurtful, always next to this relativistic approach that I mentioned just earlier, always try to keep in mind that it is coming from a place of subjectivity itself. And from that subjectivity, ideally, what ought to be done is to take what is useful, what you see as objectively useful, not as subjectively useful, in what has been subjectively expressed by the other person. So perhaps the person will say something about something you've done, like, for example, I can take a very simple example which will speak to you directly. Imagine that I make a post on YouTube and I share it on Reddit, let's say, or I could just look at the comments. But on Reddit, it's a particularly scathing, pitiless place. So, if people don't like my content and I share it on Reddit, for example, I used to share some stuff on our philosophy, or, where you have a lot of people who are, they're anonymous, and so they can also say things without fearing the consequences in a way. And so they feel like they can just lash out at people. Well, I've gotten some pretty mean comments there, but the meanness comes from the subjectivity of the person. Sometimes within that subjective meanness is located a little interesting insight. Perhaps, yes, that's something that I could have done better with regard to my video. Maybe I could have made the content more focused. Maybe I could have done this. Maybe I could have done that. It's really an art to manage to separate what is useful and objective compared to what is not useful and subjective. And always keep in mind, the wording, the form, is always the subjective part, not the content. And what upsets us usually is the form more than the content. And there's many people in the comments to my video that I released yesterday who attested to that, who said, if criticism is quite deep but phrased tactfully with respect for a person's ego or feelings, then it's okay, I can take it. Might not be pleasant, but I can take it. And I think that's exactly the approach to take. But what that suggests is that what's dangerous in a way is form. But form, the form that a person decides to give to a criticism, what is likely to upset us, is precisely what's subjective on their part. Right? And it's actually also what's subjective on our part, because that's what we will take as hurtful, the form. But it is, in another sense, it is objectively hurtful, I think. But nevertheless, there's a mediation through two subjectivities: the subjectivity of the person who emits the criticism, and then the subjectivity of your own interpretation of what is meant, which obviously filters many, many different things, and not just form, also content, and then many, many aspects of the content of what is said connect to your own individuality, to your own history. Maybe some buttons will be pushed, that the original objector or critic did not intend to push, and will upset you for those reasons. And so it's a quite careful exercise that has to be done to just manage to take apart a criticism and separate the subjectively mediated from the objectively mediated. Take the objectively mediated as useful, and usually that's not the upsetting part, and take the subjectively mediated as not useful necessarily, or as irrelevant in a way. Like the form is irrelevant to the criticism. Of course, if someone voices a criticism in a very mean, destructive, disrespectful and dismissive manner, do not take it as irrelevant, but you should take it as irrelevant to the critique. What you should not take as irrelevant is that the person probably is not a nice person and has issues themselves. And so you can really see how sometimes a criticism really says more about the other person than they say about you, and that's usually revealed in the form that the person uses. And keep in mind, the form is precisely what upsets you, and at the same time it is precisely what is subjective on their part, and therefore does not really in any way question your identity or your value as a person. It's a hard exercise, and it's again a heuristic exercise to always try to remind myself that it's not just theoretical. It's the way I explain it is very theoretical, but if you turn it into a practical exercise of reminding yourself, even if it's a theoretical reminding yourself of the inherent relativism of situations and of the inherently intersubjective nature of criticism, and of the fact that usually what upsets us is what is inherently intersubjective. If you turn this into a habit of always reminding ourselves of that, then it could start really helping us. What is really difficult with heuristic exercises is when, if you like, when it's something that we have to muster to deal with situations that are stressful very often. It's very difficult to make use of a heuristic device in situations that recur very often, because obviously summoning a heuristic device is something that we do in addition to our reaction to the situation to try to cope with it. If the situation recurs many times throughout the day, it's a really exhausting thing to summon the heuristic device, because it's an extra effort on our part. It's something that we learn and we apply. It's true that when we make it habitual, which usually happens after a few weeks of applying it, or a few instances of applying it, it starts becoming less tiring, because we have integrated within our way of reacting to the world or certain word situations such as critiques. But there's always going to be an element of it that's tiring. But then what I would say is, keep in mind that realistically speaking, you're probably not going to be exposed to criticisms that are hurtful every day. If you are exposed to criticisms that are hurtful every day, it probably means that you need to change the community where you're hanging out, if you can, because you're probably not surrounded by people whose behavior will be conducive to your blooming, your blossoming as a person, which is another aspect, but I will come to it in a second. Keep in mind, this heuristic device, applying just seeing things as relative and subjective in some sense is always very useful, but it works only if you have to apply it only from time to time, so that it's manageable and sustainable to apply. But usually, hard criticism should occur only from time to time. If it happens all the time, then really either it means that you're incredibly easily hurt and touchy and susceptible, which might suggest that you're experiencing such a state of existential angst that it could be a good idea maybe to seek therapy or to see someone if you have a serious case like this. And this is completely fine. It's important to do that, but if it happens occasionally, but whenever it happens, it's hard. The heuristic device can help. If it happens too often, but you're not particularly depressed or particularly anxious or going through a very stressful period or showing signs of pre-burnout or anything, consider that maybe there is a certain group of people that you spend time with that does not deserve that you spend so much time with. Because if they upset you all the time, maybe it also says something about them not caring about your feelings, because that's another aspect. The burden of not upsetting another person lies with the person voicing the objection the vast majority of the time. It should not be on the objectee's sort of end. It should not be on their shoulders to always take criticism well. If it's voiced tactlessly, I'm sorry, but once is okay, twice is right. Try to deal with it. But you can also communicate. If the person is someone that you know well, it's important also, and it's another aspect, to try to communicate with the person, to try to tell them literally, I want you to be a bit more careful when you voice things. It's not about the content, it's about the form. I know it's my reaction to it, but I just ask you to change it, to make that little extra bit of effort. If the person is a worthy friend or worthy acquaintance, they will do it. If they continue not to, then it might suggest you having to distance yourself a little bit from that person, because when someone voices a critique, it can give a certain air of authority to the person voicing the critique, but that air of authority always ought to be demystified, because it is not real. They deserve to be questioned as much as you're being questioned by the critique. So do try to surround yourself with people who are decent, people who are morally upright, people who are honest. You don't just want to stay in your comfort zone and hearing only the things that you want to hear. You need to be challenged. But in order to really hear and to really take into account the content of challenges to make you improve, to see things from a perspective of improvement always, how can I use this criticism to go further, to improve, and to develop a thicker skin? You need to be able to hear the criticism rather than always protecting yourself from it. If you spend your whole time protecting yourself from the possibility of being critiqued, you're sort of going to remain extremely precarious in terms of your defenses, in terms of your coping mechanisms to deal with the criticism when it happens, and it will inevitably happen. So it's good to allow oneself to be exposed to the possibility of it, but it would be ideal if when you expose yourself to the possibility of it, you do it within a domain where you know that the vast majority of the people who will voice criticisms potentially are people who are capable of being tactful, so that you take the criticism constructively instead of rejecting it because it was hurtful. Okay, so that's my perspective on the topic. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys, okay? And we'll see you very soon. Ciao!